I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Welcome. My name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the Executive Director of Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, and I'm one of your hosts this evening. I'm playing the role more or less of MC. I use L pronouns, he, him pronouns. I'm a bald guy with a goatee. I'm wearing a shirt. It's pinkish, got little pinstripes. I'm a bald guy. I have a goatee. I'm set against our virtual background showing our logo and the Capitol Dome. I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., and I reside on Anacostan ancestral lands. And I will beg for your forgiveness in any background sound. Right now is the bedtime hour, what we call the crazy eights in our household, and my 7-year-old is running around. So I want to thank my wife for taking care of all that this evening. But I do ask for your joyful tolerance if my kid jumps on my lap during our time together. I also want to acknowledge that Paulette of UUSJ is managing the technology, which is always great. We will do our best to keep things moving along for you, moving smoothly. But please treat us with some grace if things are less than perfectly coiffed. A reminder, we're recording this evening, and with Zoom having changed culture around meetings and talks and online interactions, I'll just remind you, please feel free to take care of your own household or bodily needs, but be mindful of your microphone and your video camera. Please be respectful of each other, our speaker, and your hosts. Be kind and gentle with each other. So we're pleased to have Vanessa here speaking with us this evening. As Unitarian Universalists, we're constantly striving to engage our own ideas about things, develop our understanding of the history and the context, the root causes and the root harms. Playfully, one of my interfaith friends said, the thing I love about UUs is you guys bring to the table the playful and joyful but practical skepticism that we need in our interfaith work. So hopefully we'll get some of that this evening. We're going to hear from Vanessa about taxes and tax dynamics and how that intertwines and is related to some of the history around racial justice and racial equity in our country. I think she's one of the best. She has really impressive policy chops. She's an impressive scholar working out of Brookings Institution. And I'm eager to hear her sort of pull together the content from a couple of different articles and lines of thought and research that she's been working to one talk for us. So before I introduce her formally, I want to invite Reverend Karen to open a sacred space for us and center our attention and discernment on this evening's topic. So let's give a moment to the spotlight, and then Reverend
Thank
Karen.
you, Pablo. What a joy it is to be with you all this evening. I want to invite us into a moment of centering. I know we've probably had hectic days today in this busy season. So I'm asked that we take 3 centering breaths together as we come here to be present and leave behind anything that might be weighing on our minds or distracting us from being present. So breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Our chalice lighting words today come from Athena Atena O. Danner. She describes herself as unapologetically Black, time-traveling poet and activist who dwells in the past to survive the future. She writes towards the beloved community, Black liberation, and collective imagination. This reading comes from her collection of poems, meditations, and other magic entitled Incantations for Rest, which is published by Skinner Books. You'll give me a moment, I'll light the chalice and then begin our reading. And invite you, if you have a chalice handy, to light yours as well. This is entitled Benediction to Build a World. In what world are you powerful? In this world, we can build people power together. In what world do you act on knowledge and truth? In this world, we can live and move to justice together. In what world do you hold your values in the face of what scares you? In this world, we can affirm each other's resolve to do right together. In what world are you confident in your worth? In this world, we can affirm that each of us is enough. In what world do faith and beliefs guide your choices? Together, we can build this world. In what world can you learn from those with less power? Together, we can build this world. In what world could empathy shield you from judging others? Together, we can build this world. In what world will your power plant roots and tend branches and leaves? Together, we can build that world. May it be so. As we're gathering tonight to listen to Vanessa Williamson and her topic, Taxes and American Democracy, I was thinking about Tina's words about building the beloved community and the importance of acknowledging structural racism that's throughout our society and our policies. One of the tenets of white supremacy is promoting a narrative of scarcity. And that really reminds me of tax policy and taxes and some of the threats we have been facing in our democracy. And also reminds me of our call of the eighth principle to journey towards spiritual wholeness by building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And I think it's important for me to start with myself in that dismantling process. Looking forward to hearing Vanessa's talk tonight with you all. Good to be with you.
Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Vanessa a little more formally, but I just want to give a quick request for anybody who has not already taken our child tax credit action to please look a little later on in the chat for that. We will circulate it. And as always, consider us as we enter the end of the year. We would love to get a donation if you want to see this programming continue and other great speakers brought to you, USJ. Then please solicit your time, your treasure, and your talent to make that happen. Unfortunately, politics and public policy requires resources to engage. So we need you and your friends and your friends' friends to add to our ability to do that. So with that, let me introduce Vanessa. Vanessa Williamson, PhD. Dr. Williamson is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings Institution. She's written for a bunch of different periodicals. I was going to call them rags, but periodicals such as Dissent, Washington Post, New York Times, and The Atlantic and Teen Vogue. She's appeared for major media outlets such as NPR, C-SPAN, CNN, and CNBC. She's the author of Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes, and she's the co-author of The Tea Party and Remaking of the Republican Conservatism. And she engages on a wide variety of topics that are all important to me personally, but also to USJ as an organization. So those topics include school segregation issues, tax opinion, politics, anti-union legislation, voter registration issues, democracy and organizing, taxpayer, citizenship issues, philanthropy, austerity, and white supremacy. And I'll just add a more personal note. I've had the pleasure of coming to know Vanessa over the last couple of years, and she is most definitely one of the most wicked smart folks that I've bumped into here in Washington, DC. So I'm happy that we were finally able to bring her talents to our Zoom room, and I invite her to begin her comments as soon as we have her spotlighted properly. Thank you, Vanessa.
Hi, Pablo. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I'll just add that Pablo and I are church friends, so it's a real joy to be able to sort of combine my more sort of professional work with sort of community I always feel among my fellow UUs. So I'm so grateful to be here, and thank you to Reverend Scribo for her beautiful introduction and chalice lighting. It's just really lovely. And so, yes, thank you all very much. I'm going to, right now, I'm just going to try and share my screen. So hopefully I'm going to manage to do this in a competent fashion. Let's find out. Okay. Oh, did that work? I'm going to bet on yes. Someone can tell me in the chat if it did not. How's that?
You're good.
Are we good? All right. So I want to talk to you guys today about taxation and American democracy. And particularly, I want to talk to you about the fact that it's not the story that you think. So, I mean, if we're going to imagine to ourselves, what is the story of taxation in America? I always, think that there's this terrible myth that Americans hate taxes. Here's the bald eagle crying because taxes are so damaging to freedom. And, this is sort of the conservative story that has been terribly prevalent in recent decades. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in a minute. But I think it's, to some degree, really warped our understanding of our own history, of the history of this country, and the possibilities that we have looking forward. So even though there is this sort of myth about America being an anti-tax nation, it is not true, and it has been untrue the entire time. So some of you might recognize this photo, or not photo, this picture. It is of an event that occurred in 1773 in December on a cold winter night in Boston. That water is Boston Harbor, and you will probably mostly recognize the Boston Tea Party. Which, of course, the Tea Party in recent decades and during the Obama administration, some of you may remember the sort of conservative activism that adopted the name of the Tea Party. And of course, we all know that the Tea Party was a reaction to colonial anger about British taxation. Oh, actually not. The people who threw the tea into Boston Harbor were angry about a tax cut. Not the story you hear every day, but it's true. The legislation that made the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams Patriot Organization, so angry was a piece of legislation that I think is best described as a corporate bailout. It was a large chunk of money for the East India Company, which was a corporation heavily tied up in the British government and was deemed too big to fail. And so they wrote them a big check, and they also gave the East India Company a special tax cut that allowed them to sell their tea in the American colonies more cheaply. And so this was seen by Sam Adams. Well, I'll let him speak for himself to some extent. He saw this as, in this legislation, this tax cut, this corporate bailout, as introductive of monopolies, which beside the train of evils that attend them in a commercial view, are forever dangerous to public liberty. Right? So, oh, I should also say, now we call it the Boston Tea Party, which makes it seem kind of like this sort of charming little fun event. And of course, it was a great deal of fun for the people who participated, I'm sure. But at the time, it was not seen that way. In fact, George Washington was very upset about it. Benjamin Franklin thought it was a disaster. And it was called at the time the destruction of the tea, because after all, what we're talking about here is direct action, property destruction, aimed at a corporation. It was quite a revolutionary, obviously, piece of activity. And it was quite threatening to a lot of people. And the fact that it has been adopted as sort of this anti-tax thing on the right, as opposed to a sort of left-wing anti-corporate piece of history, it really sort of demonstrates how far, I think, that our sort of public memory of taxation in America is from the actual history of our country. So the Boston Tea Party, about a tax cut, worth remembering. But of course, the colonists were, in fact, very angry about taxes as well. But let's talk a little bit about what they were really angry about, right? So what the American colonies wanted was not no taxation. In fact, when the Parliament tried to pass the Stamp Act and raise money from the colonies, they were very angry about it. And so several colonies wrote to Parliament asking how much revenue did they need? They were happy to raise the money, they just wanted to do it themselves. Because what the colonists cared about was not avoiding taxation. It was having taxation and representation. Specifically, they thought that Parliament didn't represent them. They had no representatives in Parliament, and even if they did, they'd have had perhaps one or two, and they would have been an ocean away from their constituents. You couldn't reasonably represent the American colonists in Parliament. But we did have our own local legislatures, right? We had colonial legislatures, and American colonists believed very fervently that those legislatures, because they represented the people, were the legitimate bodies that could apply taxes. So here's a little bit of language you should be able to see. These are some examples of the petitions we sent from our various colonies here in the United States to the Parliament. And what you'll notice is that they're actually very positive about taxation, right? So taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by them to represent them is the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, right? This is when Virginians still thought of themselves as British. That wouldn't last much longer. Here's from New York, right? Against these evils, the indulgence of the present Parliament, of which we have had such grand experience, cannot provide if the grand right to tax ourselves is invaded. The grand right to tax ourselves. And yet somehow this has been taught to us as an anti-tax rhetoric, right? It's quite extraordinary. All right. So if the Americans wanted to tax themselves, in fact, that they thought this was a fundamental characteristic of freedom, who was it then who didn't like taxes? Slaveholders. So if we look at our Constitution, there are some very strict provisions about taxation in it, and all of them are about not taxing slaves. That is not a coincidence, right? In the text in front of you, some of you will recognize right away, it's the 3/5 clause, right? This is the clause that famously counted 3/5 of enslaved people for the purposes of representation. It overrepresented the American South and gave slaveholders tremendous extra power in our federal government that fundamentally shaped our politics until the Civil War. What some folks might not realize, though, is that the 3/5 clause applied to both representation and direct taxes, right? So the reason we had to have an income tax amendment to the Constitution is because we had agreed on this policy of dividing taxes up by state as opposed to by individual, which basically makes taxation almost literally impossible, which was the point, right? The other two anti-tax provisions in the Constitution are also about slavery. One is that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid, right? Capitation tax is a poll tax. It's a tax on a person. So that would be one way to tax enslaved people. The other way would be to apply it was a direct tax, which was basically understood to be a tax on property, right? So enslaved people were counted as property. So they limited the capacity of the federal government to impose the two kinds of taxes that could plausibly be heavily imposed on slaveholders for their enslaved property that might possibly lead to abolition. And you see the other clause there is about limiting the tax on the importation of enslaved people, right? And you see, by the way, every now and again, the rumor makes its way back out of the woodwork that, that the Southern states were simply concerned about protecting states' rights, that they really thought the states were where government should happen and they were concerned about federal overreach. They put very, very similar clauses in place in their own constitutions, along with their own 3/5 clauses for the that would overrate the representation of the parts of the states in the South that had heavy slave populations. So the fear that taxation, even in a country that only let propertied white men vote, they fear that if propertied white men, all of them, were allowed to vote, they would vote to abolish slavery by taxing it out of existence. This was a profound fear of slaveholders, and it has fundamentally shaped our Constitution. If you hear these days that a wealth tax might be unconstitutional, well, I mean, I think being fair, the Supreme Court's commitment to precedent is obviously pretty limited, but if they were going to look at precedent, these are the pieces that they'd be looking at, right? So the policies put in place to protect extreme oligarchic wealth at the founding of our country remain the policies that protect extreme oligarchic wealth today. All right, so let's talk about something a little bit more cheerful than the slaveholders. Let's talk about the first great birth of American freedom after the Civil War, Reconstruction, right? Just a little bit of background on this. The end of the Civil War, for the first sort of 2-ish years, under the lax Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson, the Southern states are basically trying to reconstitute themselves as close to slavery as they possibly can, right? They put in place the Black Codes that limit the rights of newly freed Black people to travel, to hold particular kinds of jobs. They put incredibly heavy restrictions in place on the kinds of contracts that could be formed. So they are basically trying to rebuild slavery under another name, right? The radicals in Congress, so people like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, look at that and decide that no, we're going to do it differently. So what they do is they enfranchise Black men. And so for the first time in the American South, Black men run for office, they vote, and in places like South Carolina, where most people were Black at this period, during this period, you have a legislature that is in fact a majority Black legislature. Oh, excuse me, one of my lights just fell over. I apologize. So it's a majority Black legislature in South Carolina for a little over 8 years. You may have heard the phrase, "We were 8 years in power." That was a phrase said by a Black legislator in South Carolina about this period. So what do our radical Reconstruction legislatures do? What do we see happen to public policy in the first birth of Black freedom in America? Well, first of all, they want schools. Fundamental to the idea of freedom in America has always been public education, and public education costs money. So one of the most fundamental commitments of freed people, in fact, they set up community schools long before there are governments doing anything about schooling for Black or white people in Southern states. But one of the major commitments of the Reconstruction governments in the South is to public education. Right. And they actually, despite the fact that they face an incredibly uphill battle, and despite the fact that there are, the Klan does things like target tax collectors and murder them, you actually see quite a lot of progress on public education in this very short period of time. Right? So I put a couple examples of that on the side there. You see that literacy among Black men doubles in 10 years. Black women are for the first time more likely to be literate than Black men. And you find that where there were more Black legislators in office, taxes are higher and literacy rates are higher, right? So this was one of the fundamental commitments of the Reconstruction period, and it was something that required taxes, and is something that the new free governments put in place, right? So that's one thing. What was the other thing they were trying to do with taxes? Get land, right? Again, a very deeply held Republican idea is that freedom is not just freedom, it is independence. And for a country of farmers, independence meant having a plot of land that was your own. And it's very true. Tenant farmers really struggled, right? Because they could, if they voted the wrong way in a period where voting was basically a public act, if they voted the wrong way, they wouldn't just, they lose their job, they'd lose their home. So having a plot of land to call their own was absolutely fundamental to the idea of freedom that, you know, is the heart of the Republican experiment in this country. And so, of course, there would have been an easier way than through the tax code to provide land to freedmen. We could have simply confiscated the land of people who had committed treason and redistributed it to formerly enslaved people or poor whites for their loyalty to the Union as compensation for the years of slavery they endured after the Emancipation Proclamation across the South, right? There are almost 2 years there after the Emancipation Proclamation where people should have been getting wages and did not. Or as compensation, you know, as reparations for slavery more generally. All of those things were technically possible, but were beyond what the federal government was willing to do. And they were beyond what was achievable even in the Reconstruction states. Property confiscation was just seen as too radical. Du Bois says it would take at least another generation before ideas like this were just in common parlance, right? So they don't redistribute land, right? There's, for a brief period, General Sherman, right, his famous special order, was going to give people 40 acres, but that was overturned. So once serious land reform that the federal government could have done was off the table, the only option left was through the tax system, right? Now, there are good reasons to think this might work because slaveholders had hated taxes so much that taxes seemed like a very powerful instrument, right? Taxes on land were very low across the South, and it was one of the reasons why planters could just sit on enormous properties and they didn't have to pay taxes on it. The taxes were incredibly low. So they just sat there, they didn't have, you know, they were called a wilderness by some of the people who observed them, right? So this is a quote from Abraham Galloway, who self-emancipated, but then came back to North Carolina and became a state senator. And he said, I want to see the man who owns 1 or 2 thousandths of acres of land tacked $1 on the acre. And if they can't pay the taxes, sell their property. And then we Negroes shall become landholders, right? This was a dream across the South for any number of the more radical legislators, right? That we could use the tax, if we just made the tax system fairer, then people just sitting on these enormous tracts of land couldn't pay their taxes or wouldn't want to pay their taxes, and they'd sell the land, and then it would divide the property, right? This is a quote from Matthew Gaines, who was a state senator in Texas, one of the more radical members of the entire Reconstruction period, and genuinely one of my favorites. If you have not had the opportunity to look him up, he is tremendous. So he gives an amazing speech. He's to a crowd of, you know, relatively recently freed people, talking about the new tax code that had been put in place in Texas. And he talks about all the different parts of it, right? He talks about the new school tax, which was it was a poll tax, so everyone was going to have to pay $1. And that was something that, you know, obviously, if you were an only recently freed person, that was an expense. It was a real one to worry about. So he talked through what it was going to pay for. And he talked about also not just that everyone is going to pay taxes, but that, you know, the big rich people, former masters, were going to be paying fairly for once on their lands. So he said, if there's any virtue in taxation, we will tax them until we tax them out of their lands. In fact, so he goes to the end of the speech and then he says, you know, and he passes out pamphlets of the tax code, and he tells the folks who are listening, take these home and read them by torchlight. And when you're done, you'll say, they're not half taxes enough, right? Because this is what's going to pay for our schools. This is what's going to pay for the railroads. This is what's going to pay for the sort of the new government, the new birth of freedom that was briefly possible during this period. So taxes for schools, taxes for land were fundamental to the conception of freedom that the most radical legislators of the Reconstruction period attempted to put in place. But it provoked a backlash, as any modern person would probably have expected, having observed the last 40 years of American politics. We could have guessed that taxation, particularly taxation to create a more equal country, would provoke some backlash. So I don't know that you can see. I'll read to you a little bit of this race. This is a picture that's been cut together of a bunch of the radical members of the South Carolina legislature. As I said, that was a majority Black institution during this period. And you'll note that this little pamphlet, which was in a pamphlet that was opposed to the radicals, points out, first of all, how many of them are Black or mulatto. It points out wrongly, you won't be surprised to say, how many were literate. And then it points out how many were taxpayers. Also, as it turns out, wrongly, but the facts of these things never really matter. What matters is attacking people who are fighting for freedom. So what they wanted, so they talk about these radical legislators as not being taxpayers, right? That they're spending tax money, but they aren't themselves taxed. And so there's this wave of activism of former Confederates who had basically not really accepted the results of the war and had certainly not accepted the radical Reconstruction amendments, the political equality for Black people. And they call themselves taxpayers. They set up taxpayer leagues, they hold taxpayer conventions, they set up taxpayer unions, they coordinate attacks on tax collectors, particularly when those are Republicans or when they are Black. They provide cover, respectability, right? Because these are taxpayers. Had the same kind of tone that it has today. They provided respectability to a paramilitary terrorist force that was attempting to overthrow the government. And it's not just true in sort of particular cases. You can look at the Vicksburg massacre, any of a number of other events where taxpayer leagues were involved in violence. This is true systematically. The chances that a Black politician was violently attacked increased 3% for each additional dollar of per capita tax revenue collected in 1870. So where taxes had increased most, the violence against Black politicians was highest. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about just one of these conventions. This is the most famous one of the taxpayer conventions. It was in South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is where Reconstruction lasted longest. And it is also one of the places where the response to Reconstruction, because it was so long, it was incredibly violent. The person on the left there is a guy named Martin W. Gary. He was a Confederate general who had literally refused to surrender at Appomattox. He left instead. So he, more even than other white South Carolinians of his era, refused to accept the outcome of the Civil War and set to work almost immediately on trying to subvert the new Reconstruction governments. And so he participates in this taxpayers convention along with most of the other sort of leading lights of the antebellum South Carolina society. And they put together a long series of critiques of the South Carolina government about its corruption, about the excessive tax rates. And this gets a lot of attention in the North because at the same time, because governments in this period were all incredibly corrupt. So this is sort of Tammany Hall's time. So Northern reformers were also very concerned about corruption in government and fraud in the Grant administration. There's a lot of corruption during this period. Of course, the Northerners didn't try and overthrow the government, just the Southerners did that. But they find this rhetoric of being taxpayers an incredibly powerful tool to hide what they're actually doing. And what Martin W. Gary is doing is organizing the Red Shirts, which is a paramilitary force broadly similar to the Klan, that was extremely active in the election of 1876 and resulted in the overthrow of the rightfully elected government. And the government that was put in place, known as there were sort of redeemers, is what the phrase was used for all the white supremacist governments that overthrew Reconstruction. That is the precursor to the Jim Crow era that we would have for another 100 years. So Martin Gary got what he wanted, and he got it as a taxpayer. All right, so this is just a little bit about what tax policy looked like under those white supremacist governments. You'll know some of these things already. Poll taxes, most famously, were used to keep Black people, or Black men at the time, and also poor whites from voting. There were new fees and fines that were basically intended to trap people into the criminal justice system. They vastly increased regressive taxation. And put in place property tax caps so that wealthy people would pay less, poor people would pay more. And they also put in place supermajority requirements. Now, I grew up in California, so I'm familiar with one of these that was put in place in a later period. But this is basically a rule. If you think about what a supermajority is, it's basically minority rule. And so what these supermajority requirements did was mean that even if somehow a reformer government came into power, they would need to have not just 50% plus one, but no, they would have to have a supermajority to change the tax system, right? So this was what was, they called themselves it was the rule of the taxpayer. And this is what dominated the American South for the 100 years thereafter, approximately. So Of course, a lot of this will feel familiar, and I've already kind of gestured at this part too. We see a very similar anti-tax fervor seize the United States in reaction to the second Reconstruction, the civil rights era of the 1960s. You see, of course, the tax revolt in California, property tax cap put in place there, tax revolt in Massachusetts, property tax cap put in place there. You see Reagan's language about the welfare queen that was always compared to the hardworking taxpayer, right? So this racialized language about the white taxpayer versus the black tax consumer, right? Was language that looks terribly like what the white supremacist governments 100 years earlier had been saying. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. So my entire life, I am 41 years old, my entire life has been dominated, the sort of political rhetoric about taxation has been dominated by that era, right? The sort of Reagan era and beyond. We have had a lot of retrenchment, a lot of concern, a lot of Republican anti-tax activism. And you might think that after all that time, it would have had an enormous effect on public opinion. And I want to give you some, and with a little bit of good news on this. Okay, so first of all, here is, so this is going to be, it's not got as many pictures. I apologize, it's a little more data heavy, but okay. As I read off some different groups, please tell me if you think they are paying their fair share in federal taxes, paying too much, or paying too little. And you'll notice remarkable consistency over a very long period of time that people think upper income people and corporations are not paying enough, right? This is incredibly stable finding. You can ask the question 100 different ways, and you'll find that most people think that taxes on the rich should go up. All right, so what are people angry about when you ask them about taxes? They are angry about something. It's mostly the feeling that corporations and the wealthy aren't paying their share. The next answer is complexity of the tax system. Far more are concerned that wealthy people aren't paying their share than are concerned about the taxes they themselves pay, right? So to the extent that people are angry about taxes, they are primarily angry that the system is unfair. And the way that they think it is unfair is that well-off people aren't doing their part and that corporations aren't doing their part. Okay, again, this is something I happen to have data from 2015. It is utterly unchanged for decades on end, right? Okay, here are some other good news. You might say, okay, fine. So some people like taxes, but it's Democrats, right? It's Democrats that like taxes. Republicans hate taxes. Here's an interesting, now this is a little bit wonkier, so I'm going to talk you guys through this rather boring little chart, but it's a really nice piece of political science. So a political scientist, John Sides, did a study where he asked people about the estate tax, which Republicans had for decades called the death tax. Death tax, sounds terrible. So Democrats and independents like this tax, right? And they like it maybe a little bit. So they're two different versions, right? They first just ask the control is when you just ask them how they feel about the estate tax. The second one, called who pays, is where you tell them who pays the estate tax, which is of course the top 1% of households, or 0.1% of households, some small number. So if you tell them who pays, which is to say very, very rich people, they like it just a little bit more. Now look what happens to Republicans. At first, Republicans do not like the estate tax. But if you tell them that rich people pay it, you find that the low-income Republicans, that's here on the left, you see where the red arrow points up, you see low-income Republicans, suddenly most of them like it. There's a very big class divide among Republicans on things like taxation, minimum wage, and a bunch of other really key economic issues, right? You find that low-income Republicans actually support Democratic policies on things like taxing the rich, right? So what you're seeing here is basically that once low-income Republicans find out that rich people pay the estate tax, they think it's a great idea. We should have one. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to wrap it up here. I probably ran a little long because I will talk indefinitely about taxes. But what do we want to take away from this? The first thing is that anti-tax rhetoric is not a fundamental part of American history, except to the extent that it has been the rhetoric of democracy's opponents. And they have been very powerful in American history. But that's where anti-tax rhetoric comes from. It doesn't come from the people who want representation. It comes from the people who want to prevent representation. Of course, as any of you would guess, that kind of rhetoric has flourished in periods of reaction to the expansion of suffrage to Black people. But there's a little bit of good news here. Despite the fact that there have been decades of conservative dominance on the issue of taxation, my whole life, most Americans' anger about the tax system is unchanged. They still think rich people aren't paying enough. All right. So I just want to say thank you all very much. It was a real treat to talk about some of my wonky political science stuff with you all. And so my email address is there. I am at the Brookings Institution and the Tax Policy Center. I am more than happy to chat with any of you if you have questions. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, Dr. Williamson. So now we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. So I will ask you to please put in the chat your questions to help me track them. But because we're recording this, if you are brave, you are willing to raise your electronic hand and ask your question yourself, then you will get priority. So I will take a quick look at the chat. I think there was one question early on about Republican conservatism. And I think there was a moment in your talk where, Vanessa, where you were talking about Republicans and conservatism. And can you just clarify your thinking around the distinction between the party and the ideology?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it is the Republican Party is the party that did Reconstruction, right? They were the party of Abraham Lincoln, they're the party of Frederick Douglass, the party of Abraham Galloway, they're the party of Matt Gaines. But that is not the party we have today. So while I like to think of myself as a radical Republican, I am 150 years out of step. My first book with Theda Skocpol looked at the Tea Party, the contemporary Tea Party, the Tea Party of the Obama administration era, that fundamentally moved the already conservative anti-tax Republican Party substantially further to the right. So we looked at the ways in which they did that, how conservative media played a role, how grassroots organizing on the right played a role, the role of big money interests in the Tea Party. And so that's what we were trying to identify, was trying to talk about how, the party that had once been the party of racial justice had sort of long since abandoned those commitments, but had moved even further to the right during the administration of our first Black president.
Great, thank you. So first in the stack is Peggy, then Alan, and then I'll move to the chat questions.
Do I unmute? Is that how I ask?
Yes, go
Oh,
for it.
good. Oh, good. Okay. Well, if I understand correctly, we are judging whether corporations are paying enough taxes by feelings rather than facts. And I don't know how anyone would determine what sufficient taxes are. Is it very difficult to explain how they determine that?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea of what you think is fair is not a mathematical calculation. You're absolutely right. Ideas of justice depend on what you think the outcome should be, and that's different from a particular percentage necessarily. I think that in terms of corporate taxation, empirically speaking, corporate taxes have declined really substantially. It's a much smaller portion of federal revenues than it used to be. Top tax rates for wealthy people have indeed declined, sort of pretty persistent. I mean, there are little small jumps here and there, but at one point in the mid 20th century, the top marginal tax rate was over 90%. So there's an empirical basis for seeing taxes as lower for wealthy people and corporations today than they used to be. But this gets a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. So one thing that when we talk about how high should taxes be, we sometimes don't first question what's the denominator, right? So if we're talking about what percentage, right, it's based on, let's say, income, right? But the income you earn is not how much money you would make absent taxes. I mean, because if there weren't a tax system, there wouldn't be a government. And if there weren't a government, you wouldn't have civilization, right? So it's not actually the case that whatever amount of money you happen to have as your pre-tax income is in fact what would exist without taxation. So the idea of what a fair tax rate is, in my opinion, should be based much more on what do we want to do with the money, what kind of economic inequality do we want to see after taxes than thinking about it as a percentage of our pre-tax income, because that's not really, it's just not actually the case that the amount of money that's nominally on your pay stub is how much you would actually get if taxes were eliminated, right? We would live in some sort of terrible state of nature that would not actually involve a great deal of income for any of us. But you're exactly right. It's an incredibly tough question to think through.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Alan?
Yeah, okay. We know that Republicans generally oppose progressive taxes. What is their track record as far as other taxes? In other words, we have the impression that Republicans are against all taxes, but I'm sure there are probably some non-progressive taxes or so forth that they think are okay, flat taxes, all kind of other things, because there's some things like defense that they want to have funded, etc. So can you comment on their track record as a party, Republicans in general, as far as what kind of taxes they do like?
Yeah, so in the mid-20th century, taxation was actually not a terribly controversial issue from a partisan perspective. Both parties largely agreed that what you wanted a balanced budget. And so amazingly, taxes are not even a particularly serious component of the party platforms in the mid-20th century. It's just not a big issue. But taxes become a big issue for the Republican Party as the party seeks to capitalize on the reaction to the civil rights movement, right? The sort of anti-welfare rhetoric is an anti-tax rhetoric, and that develops very much in response to the increased access of Black people to the services government provides. When welfare was white, it was not controversial, right? So you see the party shift towards a sort of general anti-tax rhetoric, but you're absolutely right that having a general anti-tax rhetoric does not mean you oppose all taxes, right? So very much in the style of the sort of late 19th century American South, property tax caps and limits on taxes that are progressive, right, that fall on wealthy people, are accompanied by an increased reliance on more regressive taxation, and specifically an increased reliance on fees and fines. And so we see that in our contemporary era as well. States, particularly when they have limits on their tax capacity, it fill in budget gaps with fees and fines. And those, of course, are extremely regressive and are also, they're regressive anyway, right? Because if it's $50 for me and $50 for someone whose income is a third of mine, and $50 for someone whose income is 3 times mine, that's a regressive tax, right? It falls very heavily on the poor. But it's especially regressive because fees and fines are not applied fairly. They're applied in a discriminatory fashion, right? And this is one of the things that you see in things like the Ferguson report that the Department of Justice did, right? It found that police departments became predatory on communities of color, in part because there was this wonderful financial reward, right? They got all this money out of those fees and fines. And so, yeah, so you're absolutely right that it's not that there's no longer any sort of revenue source that conservatives like. It's just that it tends to be ones that are highly regressive. Now, I'll say one more thing on that. So if you're going to try and find a more broad-based tax that some conservatives will support, things like a sales tax tend to do a little better. Arizona managed to raise its sales tax rate. Some other states have managed to do that. The sales taxes are regressive as a rule, simply because if you're poor, you spend all your income. That's what it means, right? So if you don't have any money left to save at the end of the month, that you paid sales tax on everything you earned. Whereas if you're wealthy and just have huge wads of money sitting in the bank, you're not paying sales tax underneath that. But sales taxes can be arranged to be less regressive. You can do that by having them not apply to necessities, right? So only a few states have sales taxes on groceries, which is basically a 12% tax on eating. And that's in places like Alabama and Mississippi. But yeah, so you're absolutely right that not all taxes are opposed equally, and progressive taxes are opposed particularly by conservatives.
So from the chat, we have a couple of questions going in this direction, and it's the following. So Vanessa, you're the tax guru in this room. So what do you recommend we have as a fair tax system, and especially in light of places like Ohio signaling that they want to get rid of the state income tax? which is that state's apparently only progressive tax on the books. So where do you point our interest and energy given the morass you've just described?
Well, I think that it's important to remember that while politically it can be hard to raise progressive taxes, it is popular to raise progressive taxes, right? So if you're thinking about what the problems we face in raising progressive taxes, it is not the hearts and minds of average Americans. Average Americans, most of them really love the idea, including, as I noted, low-income Republicans. But of course, there are very powerful and wealthy interests that have long opposed progressive taxation, right? You see an immense amount of organization, basically as soon as the income tax amendment passes, among very wealthy individuals to sort of fund a grassroots movement against taxing the rich. So there's a political hurdle, but it's important to remember that it's not a hearts and minds hurdle. The other thing I'd say is that it's terribly important to raise enough money. So by way of an example, taxes in the American South before the Civil War were very progressive. They were also incredibly low. So almost all the taxes were paid by very wealthy slaveholders, but it was an incredibly small amount of money. They didn't mind paying it all. They just kept the government starved, right? So it's both a question of progressive taxation, but it's also a question of adequate taxation. I think both of those pieces are worth remembering, because the emancipatory power of taxation comes both from putting taxes on the very rich so that our economic system is fairer, but it also comes from having enough money to provide this kind of public goods that give everyone a chance, right? The public schools, the roads, all the infrastructure things that we love, these are all central to any kind of egalitarian society. And those things cost money. And there's no reason not to be upfront about it, because those are things that people like.
Thank you, Vanessa. And again, privileging those who ask their own question on camera. Mr. Strauss. Go for it, David. You have to unmute yourself, David.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I guess I'll have to do it this way. Dr. Williamson, I liked what you said about knowing what the outcomes of the taxation produce. It seems to me right now, I haven't run the numbers, but it seems that if we added the Defense Department budget and the budget of Homeland Security and any other part of the government that supports policing and militia and military, we probably have a majority of our taxes going to those entities and those practices which are crowding out all other kinds of expenses we might want to see. Do you have any ideas as to how that can be impacted so that it gets turned in a different direction? Because I see both Democrats and Republicans unifying around that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right to talk about this. It is one of the sort of most, I work on some pretty depressing stuff. I'll be upfront with you. But the bipartisan consensus on ever increasing military spending is probably one of the bleakest aspects of the federal budget, in my personal view. And I think that there isn't currently the kind of grassroots mobilization, sort of institutional, not just individuals' opinions, but actual institutional power that's being built to fight that. And it is, you're absolutely right, an extraordinary large percentage of our budget, and it dwarfs every other country's investment in these things. And so I think you're exactly right that if all of that money were freed up for other purposes, I think we'd have a great deal to spend, right? But it's a place where I think there's just an extraordinary gap in the mobilization against what's basically special interest funding.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the final one or two questions because halfway through your talk, it occurred to me to ask. Your talk is primarily focused on the dynamic of Black liberatory governments and the connection to our posture on taxes. But it brings to mind a question around how narratives in general play out against the issue of taxes. And I'm wondering if you put any thought into how the quickly changing narrative around immigration plays off against this question of taxes, because that's another big chunk that is narrative in nature, tied to the mythology of the American identity, where we're seeing huge changes within the last couple of election cycles around how Americans think of immigration in connection to American identity. And it occurs to me there might be similar hooks. But
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. So my second book was about why Americans are proud to pay taxes. And I presented a bunch of the data demonstrating that 90+% of Americans see tax paying as a civic duty. I mean, it was a direct attack on what a lot of the sort of mythos of American politics is. And the thing, and so that's hard to convince people of that, but I think the data is there. The thing that I found hardest to convince people of who didn't already believe it is that immigrants pay taxes. Of course they do. Undocumented people pay taxes, but the absolute commitment of anti-immigration people, just normal people who hold anti-immigration views, to the idea that they don't pay taxes. No number of facts, including presenting data from the Social Security Administration about all the money pouring in. None of that could make a dent because there is this very profound belief that tax paying is part of what makes you a good citizen, and what makes you part of the community. And it means you're an upstanding person who works hard. And so in the same way that in the Reconstruction era, white supremacists constantly doubted that Black people paid taxes, today we have not only the sort of old welfare queen rhetoric that's 40 years old, but a very, very serious sort of stereotyping and utterly wrong information that people hold about immigrants and their tax paying. Because if you had to accept that immigrants pay taxes, you might have to consider them part of your community. And for people who cannot make that jump, they cannot accept the facts.
Thank you. And then, very final question. In my mid-20s, I got my first statement from the IRS about what I was going to be getting from the Social Security Administration upon retirement. And it sort of projected out, like, if you can't maintain this income level, you'll have a regular payment of X. If you increase it, it'll do this, that, and the other. It sort of sketched out some scenarios for me. And I was a young public policy person working for a governor. And I turned around and I remember showing this to our chief of staff and saying, gee whiz, why don't we do the same thing for taxes and show people how much, how much their taxes thus far in life have been paying for roads, paying for this, paying for that, to demonstrate the case to folks that their taxes actually do them personally some good. And the idea was basically dead on arrival. But I want to ask you, like, is there any sense in that kind of demonstration of what your taxes do?
Yeah, so I can tell you that those green sheets of paper that you received, part of their rollout was randomized and it was studied by social scientists, and it worked. People felt the way you did. That's not just your feeling, that's what happened. People felt more confidence in Social Security, and they felt more positive about their own personal benefits in the future, right? So yeah, that worked. We stopped doing it. I can't imagine why, that was one of the things that got cut. I believe there's also examples that can work at a local level. You can do the same thing for property taxes, of course. You get you get your homeowner, you get a statement and you're like, oh, they fixed those streetlights on my street. That does seem like a good thing. I'm awfully glad they did that. So yeah, those things can work. They have also tried it for the federal budget and it hasn't worked. Now, they may not have done the presentation in a way that was individualized enough, or reasonably enough. If you look at the federal budget, you will see an enormous amount of money goes to military spending, and you might not feel that that is well spent. There's certainly So it may be that the federal government actually has enough objectionable things in it for people that it doesn't work. But yeah, no, it's absolutely the case that if that there are things that people love that government spends money on, and if you remind people of that and you provide them with information about where their money's going, they do feel better about it.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, Dr. Williamson. I appreciate your time this evening. And now I want to turn the spotlight over to Reverend Karen, who will close us out.
Wow, what a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much, Dr. Williamson, for sharing your insights and the history behind a lot of these things that many of us don't know, as we don't know our American history. And you've really shown some light on that, in addition to some of the connections of those faulty narratives. So thank you so much. And again, I think this will be something we'll all be thinking about for a lot of time to come. So thank you. So I wanted to close out with extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment that we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Wishing you all a good evening.
Thank you. So, as is our custom, I will hang around in that post services coffee hour vibe, but I invite Vanessa and Reverend Karen to go on and to roll off and to continue the rest of their evening if they like. This is sort of the soft close of our event. But for those of you who have lingering questions, either about UUSJ or anything else, you have the executive director on the horn. So it's a good time to make use of that. It's more free for all. I'll give it about 5 minutes or so. And if no one's feeling brave or no one has questions for me, then we'll do our hard close. And I will remind you, if you haven't taken our child tax credit action, please go ahead and do that. And there will be a press conference that's led by Interfaith Partners on Wednesday. I'm sorry, on Thursday, the 15th. So you can tune in. I'm going to be sending UUSJ folks an email about that. But basically, if you follow the Twitter handles, child tax credit, you should be able to view the session remotely. Suzanne, please, I see your hand. I recognize you. Please ask your question.
Thank you. So gosh, this session is the first time I heard that Ohio is planning to eliminate the income tax. And since I live in Ohio, do you have guidance as to how we should respond to that here? Or do you want to send me something later? Or
I mean, I can circle back, but UUSJ really does focus on the federal, and Ohio is one of the states that's blessed with a fully functional state action network.
Okay.
It feels like that fight would be.
So UUJO, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But to the extent that your federal legislators start proposing, ideas coming out of that state legislature for the national audience, then I would expect UUSJ to get involved more directly.
Okay.
The other thing I'll say that, that's going to sort of be unfortunately, it's likely to be a dynamic, like for the foreseeable future. So if you have a state legislature that's very active in proposing things that are more naughty than nice, I beg you to let me know about them, because the pattern in the previous Congress was that some of the things that were coming out of state legislatures found a parallel in Congress with the minority party. And although they didn't get much traction,
Mhm,
because they were the party in minority,
mhm.
that's going to be the party of the majority in the next Congress. So there will be, at least on the House side, an expectation of more onerous and repressive
Mhm.
proposals, at least being put up on the board for consideration.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then the statement about the taxes was from actually somebody in the audience. So if you can go back to, you can actually download the chat, but it was somebody had a question that they aimed at me.
Yeah,
Okay,
actually, Lori Albright, she's gotten me directly. We're in the same congregation.
awesome.
So-
So there you go. Dave Mintz, please ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Curious about the what you see as the prospects for the child tax care credit in the lame duck, or I assume that prospects aren't good beyond the lame duck, but what do you see?
Well, I know that we have to push for it now, that our best chance for, the 5 or the 10 or the 20 things that we really care about is now. That we, as Unitarian Universalists, have to be willing to get a little down in the mud and play the political game. And the political game is apply as much pressure on your senators or on your members of the House as possible now to either push forward the things we need and want, or to extract the things that we don't want. So you may have noticed last week there was a big push around the permit deal and the House. And this week, on that same topic, the big push is going to be on the Senate. On the CTC, there was a huge press last week to try and lift up the stories of American families who benefited from the child tax credit. And this week, the pressure is being applied mostly to the Senate to try and move them in the direction of getting the child tax care. Keep on doing that, but it's the CTC done. If it doesn't get done this Congress, Reverend Dr. Beckman's talk last week actually gave me some hope for optimism, some optimism that, as the dust settles, we may find that centrist Republicans have more sway. It's a real possibility that he envisions as possible. He's not promising. And so that means maybe, if it doesn't pass in this Congress, there'll be another crack at it, but it will not be the robust version that's on the table right now. It will be a slimmed down version. And in just the same way, Vanessa's comments they keyed my memory about our entire experience of the Build Back Better plan. There was a big version, and there was a lot of push for that, but in the end, it was the slim version, and it was because the anti-tax forces really applied pressure against that big vision version of the bill, and it was Leader Schumer's, negotiating savvy that kept Senator Manchin engaged to some degree in the back rooms. That yielded the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, it wasn't the version that I would have authored, but I don't have special insight into how you manage Senator Sinema or Senator Manchin. I just know that I would have preferred the bigger version. Catherine, you are on mute.
Will there be a way to access the recording of this event?
Yes, absolutely. For
Could you
those,
say?
yes, it will be an email. You will receive an email.
Got it. Okay.
So one of the perks of, RSVPing is you get the video well before everybody else. You get it as soon as Paulette, our wonderful administrative assistant, can manage to trim off the front and the end and the parts that don't make sense for a public, showing.
Okay, thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome. Any other questions? Well, if I don't,
Maybe,
oh,
yeah,
yes, go for it, Joni.
yeah. My question is, do we need to sign up for, in order to find out about these? I probably got it, not because I've signed up for a newsletter or anything, but because I've connected with You the Vote, maybe, or with something.
Somebody you. Yeah, so the best way to do that is really to go to our webpage. That's www.uusj.org and sign up for our e-news and tell us your preferences on issues and start taking some of the actions that we offer so that our database can get a sense of what you care about.
Okie doke, thanks.
And yeah, maybe if Paula can drop the website in the chat. But yeah, even in the chat here, there was a CTC action that we dropped. So take it.
Did that, and I also copied the chat.
Awesome.
So I've got some connections. Thanks.
And you know, I'm seeing Fred Van Dusen's tile here. So I'm just going to say UUSJ has 4 policy areas that we work. And we work in the healthy democracy space. That's the team led by Fred. Maybe he'll, if he's actually there, maybe he can say something about what the team's doing. We work in the immigration space. We work in the environment and climate justice space. And we work in the economic justice space. So Vanessa's talk tonight was really great because it sort of brought together economic justice and democracy. But for those of you who care about the environment, you should know that one of her best and most built out case studies and examples is actually built around climate change, because she sees that as one of these areas where if we don't get our attitudes about taxes in line with reality, then we're gonna be suffering quite drastically. And she has some wonderful articles that came out in relationship to the Charlottesville, Virginia incident. So she engages with the public on these issues regularly. Yeah.
There are too many areas, and the League of Women Voters is my major way of connecting. But this is, you know, you're covering all our issues.
Well, you know, listen, I mean, let me just share with everybody who's a little new to our offerings that UUSJ has a small staff complement, and a lot of what we do is driven by UUs who are passionate about the issues, who give of their time and their energy and their volunteer hours to research and monitor bills and make sure that we're understanding everything that we need to understand and deploying the resources at the moment that makes sense. So, you know, in consultation with me and others, the teams for each of these groups are deciding, you know, is it an action hour where we're all calling the senators to pester them, or is it an action alert, or is it meetings? And I'll just give you an example. We're pulling together some UUs from Mississippi for a conversation with their Senator Wicker tomorrow around the Afghan Adjustment Act. So that's going to be an advocacy meeting, which is the thing that UUSJ is best known for. You know, and we'll invite those people by Zoom, and we're going to try and change Senator Wicker's mind around co-sponsoring the Afghan Adjustment Act, because that's another one of the things we want to see accomplished during the lame duck. So if
That's the Afghan Adjustment Act?
Yeah, the Afghan Adjustment. Yeah. So I mean, if you like getting into the room with these, you know, younger staffers and telling them your peace of mind about what they should know and what their senator should be doing, or their representative of Congress, then within the ecosystem of UU justice making organizations, it is UUSJ whose core ministry is federal engagement. So the amplification, the pressure, the social media stuff, we participate and do what we can. The witness, especially when there's any witness event in DC. So we were, there the other day in front of the Supreme Court around the issue of Moore v. Harper. But our primary bread and butter really is the advocacy interactions, trying to lift up UU values and principles in front of the staff, and change the minds of the policy staff with regard to the decisions that are being made internally in each one of the offices. That's what we strive to do. And I always say, UU's the good news is we know we can do this work because the Quakers are a far smaller denomination than we are, and they've got a much larger organization. But they, as a denomination, as a faith community, have really committed to a movement for federal advocacy. So when you see or hear Pablo talking about UUSJ is trying to build a movement for federal advocacy, that is what we're talking about.